Once again, welcome back. You are listening to the second lecture in part 3 of my multi-part lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. In the first lecture of part 3, I discussed the birth of bioethics and the new frontier of medicine. I ended that lecture alluding to two groups of individuals who really pioneered responding to the ethical dilemmas that the new frontier of medicine created, the theologians and the philosophers. In this lecture, we will learn more about these two groups and what shaped their perspectives on bioethics and how they shaped bioethics as we know it today. After viewing this lecture, students should be able to compare and contrast the theologians and the philosophers, discuss the Jeffersonian compromise in relation to bioethics, and explain the role of reason when responding to bioethical dilemmas. So, I know I said we were going to talk about the pioneers of bioethics from the 1960s and 1970s, but to understand the foundational belief systems that guided the pioneers, we must return to ancient Greece and the work of Plato. Plato posed a question that is often considered the quintessential question of ethics. Plato asked, is it the case that something is good because God approves it, or is it the case that God approves what is good? Well, this seems like a logical fallacy or circular logic at first. I encourage you to pause and consider what Plato is really asking. Looking at Plato's question, if the former statement is true, if it is the case that something is good because God approves it, then ethics must be an aspect of religion and theology. However, if God approves what is good, then ethics is a moral philosophy independent of religion or theology. Enter the pioneers of bioethics. We have two groups, the theologians, who believed that what is good is because God approved it, and therefore they approached bioethics as an aspect of religion and theology. The other group, in contrast, the philosophers, believed that ethics was independent of religion and instead should be grounded in reason and philosophy. First, we're going to briefly discuss the theologians. The theologians were students of the nature of God and religious truth. And these individuals took an interest in the implications of this new frontier of medicine and how that this could be applied to understand fundamental matters such as human nature, human destiny, the value of life, and the meaning of illness and suffering. However, as we discussed in the first PowerPoint as well, not everyone is going to agree on the answers to these questions, even amongst theologians. So there were some fundamental differences that occurred between the theologians. There was no one single religious, quote, voice at the beginning of bioethics. There was no one single religious viewpoint answer to these questions. And this was because the different theologians came from different theological traditions, different backgrounds. And what this shows us today is the debates that still occur between those who follow religious orthodoxy and religious progressivism. So the other group of pioneers that we're going to look at are the philosophers. And the philosophers were students of the ancient pursuit of wisdom and enlightenment about how you should best live. And the philosophers' contribution to bioethics was that they often staffed the institutions that helped to establish bioethics as an acceptable interdisciplinary field dealing with ethical, social, and legal aspects of the advances in medicine and medical science. So the philosophers really set the stage for the social policy of bioethics from the 1970s forward. However, they would not have been able to make these advances if the philosophers and the theologians did not bridge their differences. So now we're going to kind of look at what these two pioneers of bioethics agreed upon and what some of their differences were. So you might be thinking that the theologians and the philosophers seemed very similar, and a lot of times I have found that these two groups, their names have been used interchangeably, but there are some very important differences that I wanted to bring to light here. And I really like how Vincent Berry describes the difference between theologians and philosophers. And he does this on page 65 of his textbook, Bioethics in a Cultural Context. And what Berry said is, it has been said that philosophy is like standing in a dark room and looking for a black cat. Theology, on the other hand, is like standing in a dark room, looking for a black cat and shouting, "Found it." And when you think about the foundation of theology versus philosophy, this sentence starts to make sense. Theologians place their trust in faith and an overarching universal truth, whereas philosophers place their trust in reason and rational demonstration. For theologians, the final truth has been found. They know their final truth, that universal truth that comes from faith. However, the philosophers are still searching for that final truth. For the theologians, the source of authority is a divine being greater than them. And for philosophers, the source of authority is secular and human-based. So therefore, the philosopher is in the room looking for the black cat, never really sure if he's found it, because he's focused completely on reason and rationality. And can you truly see the cat in the dark? And you're looking and looking and looking for that cat. Where on the other hand, the theologian has the truth about the cat. They have found an item in that room, and they have the faith that that item they found is the cat. So just some basic understandings of the difference between the grounding of theologians and philosophers. Going back a few slides, if you remember, the philosophers and theologians were the pioneers that were going to respond to the testing of the established social limits of the time. They were the individuals that were going to determine the ground rules to govern this new biology, new individual liberties, and new research, and also determine where permissible limits should be drawn. So these two very different groups of individuals met regularly at the Smithsonian's Belmont Conference Center. And in February of 1976, they had an intensive 4 days of deliberation. And while they did not come from common belief systems, as we saw on the previous slide, they had some common interests and viewpoints. And these commonalities were what would allow them to bridge their differences and come up with some very important answers as the foundation of bioethics. So, what did they have in common? They shared views, interests, and purposes regarding healthcare. They believed that health was the ultimate goal of medicine, and that the purpose of the medical sciences was to benefit and use life. So the purpose was to advance human life. Therefore, about humans, both groups believed that humans have inherent dignity and worth. They also understood that to respond to these established social limits and to provide any level of indication about answering these important questions, they had to have support of the medical professionals. They also shared a state of mind influenced by the Enlightenment. Both groups came forth with this desire to balance utility, which is the greater good for all, and autonomy, which was individual preferences. They both had a sense of faith and rationality. They were both very rational groups. and they both had a background of inheritance of a national religious identity that tended to stem from Judeo-Christian Enlightenment traditions. So this was the groundwork, the common agreements on which bioethics would be grounded. No pun intended. So our last tidbit of our history lesson is the Jeffersonian Compromise. The original Jeffersonian Compromise became part of the United States Constitution, and this was the idea of separation of church and state, that religious liberties of individuals would be protected. However, they would be separated from the church and state and law, and anything that would be part of state and law needed to go through the scrutiny of common sense and being reasonable, not just grounded in religion. The founders of the modern-day bioethics realized they, too, needed to come up with some type of compromise, because not only were the pioneers having different point of views, but they wanted to appeal to a broad audience. Their goal was to appeal to not only theologians and philosophers, but also individuals who were conservative and liberal, the orthodox and the progressive, the scientist and the non-scientist, the physician and the patient. So what they ultimately adopted was this idiom or idea that any particular theology or philosophy was inappropriate for shaping policy in a secular pluralistic society. Therefore, they could not just rely on one theology or one philosophy to ground bioethics in. Bioethics needed to be grounded in publicly acceptable reasons that would provide desired conceptual frameworks that would offer a universal appeal. So this allowed them to maintain neutrality on religious, theological, and philosophical grounds. However, there has been statements made in the 21st century that this Jeffersonian Compromise is now open to renegotiation, and that the trade-offs to produce neutrality may have in themselves become a specific standpoint. So while you're trying to be neutral between these stances, did your neutrality create a third stance? And that's just something to consider as we go through this course. While the Jeffersonian Compromise is being reconsidered in this day and age, back in the 1960s and 1970s, it seemed reasonable, and it was essentially necessary. The concepts of separation of church and state that underlie the Jeffersonian Compromise allowed the theologians and philosophers to come to the agreement that bioethics should be grounded in reason, with religious neutrality. Therefore, in instances of bioethical dilemmas, reason, not religion, should serve as the source of truth. Reason would thus provide a universal understanding for bioethics. This would allow humans to have self-determination when faced with ethical dilemmas. Thus, bioethics was built on basic guiding principles and values that fostered and promoted individual freedom and autonomy in alignment with the tolerance of multiple diverse viewpoints. In our next lecture, we're going to look at the specific guiding principles and values that have become to define or be synonymous with the term bioethics.